having talked about the trinomial philosophers that Roy Wood Sellars led, William Pepperell Montague and those people, these are contemporaneous and much more important, flourishing in the 20s, in the teens of the 20s, and on into the 30s. And they're not as well known as they should be. If you go to the philosophy department in Warsaw, the entrance hall has pillars, and these figures are, just these figures are up on pedestals. You look up at these things. It's a fabulous thing. In particular, Twardowski, who is the founder of it, is not well known, but is a Brentano student, overlapped with both Husserl and Meinong, who are better known, and made a really important distinction that Brentano had not, between two kinds of content, sort of the objects you're talking about and what you're saying about them. Well, they're thinking the objects you're thinking about and what you're thinking about them. And Meinong and Husserl, as soon as this book came out, there was a rewriting of his, of Twardowski's habilitation, immediately changed what they were writing to take this point on board. Anyway, even though he wasn't a logician, he was in favor of it, and he presided over the training and then professoring of these four figures, Jukowitz, Kotobinsky, Lesniewski, and Lukasiewicz, who did fabulous things between them. I've mentioned some of the minor figures here as well. If you do logic, you'll recognize those names as well. And they in turn justified their existence by training Tarski, one of the great logicians of the century. So you can think about this as just more mysteries of early 20th century philosophy, along with critical realism and so on, if you like. Kotobinsky is the one who took an idea that Brentano had, gave it a name, reism, the idea that all that exists in the world is objects, stuff that can be named, and in particular adopted a strategy of distinguishing between real names, which at least potentially refer to actual things, and fake names, which he included expressions like triangularity as a fake name. And his word for fake names is onomatoids. That isn't a term that caught on, but it's absolutely apropos to the line that Sellars then endorses. He mentions Kotobinsky in a couple of places. Sellars says he's going to adopt a frankly inegalitarian attitude towards nominalizations. So nominalizations, nouns formed from other parts of speech, well, you can nominalize nouns too. And he thinks that all nominalizations of parts of speech other than nouns are onomatoids. But now, by contrast to Kotobinsky, he has the idea that they're metalinguistic onomatoids, and on that basis proposes to give an account of them. So nominalizations of attributive adjectives like red, you form redness from it, or triangularity are covertly metalinguistic. But so are nominalizations of sentences. So the expression, that snow is white, is a noun formed from a sentence. The common noun that goes with things like that is propositions. So he thinks propositions are all onomatoids as well. They're all fake names. Now, he accepts with Frege that a fact is a true proposition. Frege says thought in the sense of a thinkable. And so facts are also, fact is also a common noun classifying onomatoids. That there are no facts as well. For nominalizations of nouns, of common nouns, he thinks there's a distinction between nominalizations that form genuine names and nominalizations that form onomatoids. So lionhood goes in a box with triangularity. That's describing, that purports to name a kind of universal. So universal is a common noun that triangularity would fall under, but it's not a proper common noun because triangularity isn't a proper name, and neither is lionhood. He thinks lionhood, even though it's formed from a common noun, it belongs in the same box with triangularity. The difference between the common nouns and attributive adjectives is that where the attributive adjectives just have circumstances of appropriate application, well, and consequences too, the common nouns have circumstances of appropriate application, to call something a lion, but they also have criteria of identity and individuation. But when you form lionhood, he thinks you're only appealing to the criteria of application, not to the criteria of identity and individuation. So you're using what they share, what a term like lion shares with a term like is triangular, rather than what's distinctive of them. But there is a way of forming a proper nominalization which appeals to the criteria of identity and individuation, and that's to form a distributive singular term, like the lion. So he wants to say, when you say the lion is tawny, that's just equivalent to if Leo is a lion, then Leo is tawny, or all lions are tawny, which only talks about individual lions. It just does it in a sort of collective sort of way. He gets a little bit tangled up there with distinctive features of generics of the kind that Michael Thompson has investigated. Well, the lion is quadrupedal. That doesn't mean that there can't be three-legged lions. Those considerations really don't have anything to do with the notion of distributive singular term that he's applying here, but he does spend some time beating around in that bush. So far, I think this is just what we talked about last time. His idea is that the lion is a one in many that's okay, by contrast to a notion of universals that apply to particulars. So remember his slogan that the problem of the one and the many is broader than the problem of universals, of making sense of universals. And he's going to appeal to this notion of distributive singular terms as a way of getting a one out of many that is gaining ground, is less committive than a one in many that has the form of a universal. Now, I at least gestured last time at some other ways of, if not nominalization, at any rate, forming nouns from other nouns. And the one I focused on was abstraction, that if you have a set of singular terms and an equivalence relation among those objects, then you can introduce a new term on the model that Frege gives us of introducing directions from talk about lines together with the equivalence relation parallel to. You fix the criteria of identity and individuation of directions by saying the direction of line A is the same as the direction of line B, just in case A is parallel to B. So you use what you already know how to talk about in the old vocabulary in order to introduce these new expressions. Another way of introducing new singular terms on the basis of your capacity to use a set of singular terms is to introduce sets. Remember in CDCM, Sellars talks about labeling and what more you need to add to it to get descriptions. If you have just labels, you don't even need to have descriptions, though descriptions are fine. You've got some things labeled L. You can say that relative to that label, that the set of L's or the extension of L is the same as the set of M's or the extension of M, just in case every L is an M and every M is an L. If that's so, then the sets or extensions associated with those labels are the same. Now, that's a kind of abstraction. It's a distinctive kind of abstraction. People have been tempted to, on grounds of parsimony, I think, to take that form of abstraction and reduce all the other forms of abstraction to that, and say, well, we should think about directions just as equivalence classes, just as sets of all the lines that are parallel to each other. That's an optional move. It's a critical step in introducing sets by this method, that you do it recursively. So I've introduced the new label, the set of L's, on the basis of the things that are labeled L, and now I can treat that as a new label, so that I can have all the things that are either labeled L or labeled set of L. And that's different from the set of L's. And this is the step at which nominalists like Nelson Goodman or Quine in the first half of his career want to get off the bus, because it leads you to distinguish between objects and the unit set of that object, and the unit set of the unit set of that object, and the set that consists of that object and its unit set, which is different from all the rest of those. And they want to say, no, there's just that object there. Now that points to another way of introducing new singular terms based on an old vocabulary of singular terms, which is mereologically. And Lesniewski, Koterbinsky's colleague here, is the originator of the term and the discipline. Mereology sort of entered Anglophone philosophy with Leonard and Goodman's 1941 book, A Calculus of Individuals. But as they acknowledge in that book, they were basically just cleaning up Lesniewski's mereology, which had only been published in Polish. In mereology, you're using a part-whole relation. It's like forming sets, except you don't do it recursively on the model I just mentioned. Everything that's resolvable into the same set of objects that you started with counts as the same thing. It's a myriological sum of the same things. So I just wanted to mention that while we talk about nominalizations in a grammatical sense, the term nominalization is a grammatical term, it's a distinctive way of forming new singular terms from other parts of speech. And when Sellars distinguishes between forming lionhood by abstraction from is a lion, and distinguishes that from forming the distributive singular term the lion, those two ways of forming new terms from old terms should be laid alongside not only abstraction, but forming sets, forming myriological sums. Those are all ways of introducing new expressions based on old ones. And many people have been concerned about the difference between introducing sets and introducing myriological sums in something like the same spirit that Sellars is concerned with the difference between introducing abstractions and introducing distributed singular terms. That is, they want to read ontological significance into that semantic distinction. So obviously in all these cases it's really important to understand the semantics, and that's what I've sort of waved my hands at here for abstraction, set formation of sets, and formation of myriological sums. Now, for Sellars, introducing distributive singular terms is only the first step. I mean, that's a distinctive technical innovation of his, but there's nothing metalinguistic going on in forming the lion. It's metalinguistic only in that you're forming one expression based on the use of another expression. If we think of wanting to come up with a sense of metalinguistic in which we could sustain the thought that what you're doing when you say that triangularity is a property is classifying is triangular as a predicate in the face of the objections, really the three objections that the counterfactuals are wrong, the translations are wrong, and you're introducing you're appealing to a universal, namely predicate, in classifying these things, so that you would at most be trading non-linguistic universals for linguistic ones, which might be clarificatory, but if you ontologically have a taste for desert landscapes and want to minimize your ontological commitments, that's not as nominalistic as people aspire to be. So one thing you could do is introduce a kind of quotation, star quotation. Asterisk red, asterisk, is formed by abstraction from the term red, where the equivalence relation plays the same functional role in its home language as red plays in English. So the German word rot would be asterisk red. But so would the French rouge. be. Playing the same functional role as, with respect to the language moves, but also the language entry and language exit moves. And Sellars is perfectly happy to say, look, you can draw the boundaries around what's the same functional role, either quite loosely or more tightly. Each is going to give you a different abstract referent for the asterisked expression. That is going to be an abstraction. We say the star roll of red is the same as the star roll of rot, just in case those two words stand in this equivalence relation, that they play the same functional role in their home languages. So we're introducing this star red by abstraction, strictly parallel to the way we would introduce directions on the basis of the parallel relation of being parallel between lines. This new form of quotation is an instance of what he calls illustrative sign designs. That is, you've specified what the functional role is by displaying an instance of it, displaying a term that plays the functional role that you're going to end up exhibiting. And that already means that when you translate from one language to another, you're going to have to translate inside the quotation marks. So in German, you're going to have to talk about star rot, not about star red. So these are not going to be like standard quotation marks where if someone has made the remark in Italian and in the English translation, I translate Galileo said, but inside the quotation marks, cui il si muove, still it moves, that he said. If the whole thing was in Italian, I translate that. I don't translate what's inside the quotation marks. But for these star quotes, you would. That's something that you get for the illustrative sign design formation of them. And you might even get the counterfactuals right. That is, we could say, rot would still have been a star red, even if no one had ever spoken English. We're saying that in English, we're formulating the counterfactual in English, but the circumstance we're describing is rot playing the functional role that it does in German, and we're just in our counterfactual, in our specification of the counterfactual in English, using the English way of picking out that functional role, which is okay even if the counterfactual situation we're considering is one in which no one can speak English. After all, we can say in English, it's possible that no one ever spoke English. It could have happened that no one ever spoke English. I mentioned Abraham Lincoln. If we all agreed to call a tail a leg, how many legs would horses have? And the answer is 4, because you don't change how many legs a horse has by talking differently. That was in a counterfactual situation in which we spoke differently. Still, in English, the thing to say would be, they have 4 legs. It's just the sign design, horses have 5 legs, would be true in that other language. But that's only because it wouldn't say that horses have 4 legs. So this star quotation, using the illustrative sign design principle, gets the translation facts right. It's a sense of metalinguistic that gets the translation facts right, and arguably gets the counterfactual facts right. I mean, I think it's iffy when we talk about counterfactual. What if no one had ever spoken? Do we think that there still would have been these functional roles to play or not? And in particular, can Sellars think that? On the other hand, he might be willing to bite the bullet and say, well, if no one had ever spoken any language, triangularity would not be a property. I think that's what he's committed to. But that star red is just introducing other abstracta. I mean, we've got these abstract functional roles that we've introduced. So they're linguistic things rather than non-linguistic ones, but we've just traded things like triangularity for things like functional roles. And that's not good enough. That's not nominalistic enough. Or at any rate, it's a different grade of nominalism. It's only a halfway point to eliminating commitment to what's referred to by expressions introduced by abstraction. So you've cut down the set of abstracta that you're committed to, but you haven't eliminated it. So one could still aspire to go farther, and that's what dot quotes do. Because with dot quotes, by contrast to these star or asterisk quotes, we don't introduce them by abstraction, we introduce them as distributive singular terms. So to be a dot red is to be something that plays the same functional role as red does. But we can say that without commitment to functional roles, just as we can say the lion is a distributive singular term that in its distinctive way refers to lions, particular lions, without us being committed to lionhood as what all those lions share. So using dot quotes gives us a kind of quotation, a kind of metalinguistic formation that not only, that uses the illustrative sign design principle in a way that gets translation and counterfactuals right, but forms a distributive singular term rather than introducing a new term by abstraction, and so uses only this wider sense of a one in many, and so doesn't just trade worldly abstractions for linguistic abstractions, but really needs nothing but distributive singular terms. So that's the full sort of technical apparatus that he introduces, so that he can now say that what you're doing when you say triangularity is a property is saying dot is triangulars are monadic predicates. You're predicating something of the distributive singular term. You can think of that as like what you're doing when you say the lion is tawny. Now he considers lots more complications because expressions like that have dot quotes in them, we can form distributive singular terms by dot quoting them, and he can't resist exploring sort of what happens if you do that. But that's in the end his account, his response to the recognition that the way Carnap put his metalinguistic analysis just wasn't going to cut the mustard. Couldn't satisfy these three criteria of adequacy, and Sellars builds up his technical apparatus piece by piece until he's got something that does. And I think that sort of modulo these reservations about whether all the counterfactuals, or you're going to have to deny some of these counterfactuals, but by and large, I think his apparatus does what he says it does. And this is what he lays out in Grammar and Existence and Abstract Entities. Is that story clear? I mean, it's complicated because there's all these stages in it. But distributive singular terms and the illustrative sign design principle, and then looking at metalinguistic distributive singular terms formed using the sign design principle in place of abstractions. That's how he thinks we should understand things.
So when distributed singular terms were introduced, so like the lion is an obligate carnivore or something like that. So you could also almost always say something like lions are obligate carnivores. And I don't know if this is just the connotation that I have, but when you say the first one, like the lion is a carnivore, it sounds almost more prescriptive or normative than saying that lions are carnivores, which sounds kind of just like a general observation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, though it's a distinctive kind of normativity. It's the kind that Thompson gives us a good account of. I mean, one of his examples is pine trees thrive in sandy soil. Mm-hmm. He's sort of saying what the healthy environment for them is. Mm-hmm. But his view is that this is just distinctive of biological kind terms. Mm-hmm. You know, if we talk about copper coins, for instance, the copper coin conducts electricity. Now I think that sort of teleological normative element doesn't go with it. You know, Aristotle's way of acknowledging this without invoking the quasi-normative aspect, which is very important for Thompson, is to use the expression generally or for the most part. And that you can use either with the lion or with lions. But I think you're right, there's some more oomph to it than you get with the generally or for the most part. It's sort of the proper lions, the ones that are as they ought to be, lions. And Aristotle gets that in a different place in his work.
So for Sellars, he doesn't necessarily read this normative.
Right.
He's interested in the singular part.
Right.
Right.
So for him it functions just the way lions does, except grammatically it gives you a singular term instead of a plural one.
And doesn't he play around with that a little bit at the beginning of Abstract Entities? I think he sort of trying to figure out what the right expression for what he means is, and he ends up with the format.
Yeah, as I say, I think he gets entangled in these issues about biological generics that he's using that are actually orthogonal to what he's doing.
And in the copper case, would he then, it sounds weird to say like the copper coin because it's not such a like natural kind, I suppose. Like you might say like the element copper conducts electricity, or the metal copper.
How about the Olympic gold medal brings joy and tears?
Okay.
But
that's
rather
still
than just a copper coin.
Yeah, but like
sort of
the
who cares,
coin is less related to its conducting electricity than the metals
right.
invoking emotions.
Right.
But you could
It's
say-
more about it being copper than it being a coin, is what I'm getting at.
Right,
Yeah.
well, I just wanted something, because copper's a mass noun.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, okay. Mhm.
and common nouns are count nouns. This is Quine's idiom for them, so you need to use a classifier. And Quine is fascinated by the fact that in Japanese, to a first approximation, everything's a mass noun, but you have these classifier kinds. So, as we would say, have a piece of paper, they will say a classifier paper, but the piece you only use for things that are flat and floppy. And you'd use a different classifier for saying, I have a piece of pen here. You use that for long, pointy, or circular, or cylindrical things. And there's a couple dozen of these classifiers for different kinds of things. Okay. Now, he goes into I think in many ways, a much deeper set of issues in naming and saying. And let me just indicate some of those issues before I talk about how the other technical innovation that he has, Jumbleese, addresses those things. I would say, other than the myth of the given, anybody, there are lots of people, all they know about Sellars is he thought the given was a myth. But if you look at the next cut, who know a little bit more, what they know is dot quotes and Jumbleese. Those were bits of conceptual machinery that other philosophers have continued to find useful. Even though most people who talk about dot quotes treat them as naming functional roles, as don't appreciate the distributive singular term character of them, which is absolutely essential to them being what they are. Okay. So here's a constellation of issues that, I don't know how familiar each one of them is. But one of them is the issue of characterizing the unity of the proposition. Whitehead tells the story of how difficult it was to live in Cambridge when Wittgenstein was there. And it gives us an example, pounding on his door at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it's Wittgenstein who was completely beside himself. And Whitehead says, what's wrong? What's wrong? He says, what is the form of the proposition? What holds the proposition together? What is the form of the proposition? And Whitehead says, that's all that's bothering you. He says, that's all? Yes, what is it? And Whitehead says, P? And Wittgenstein says, well, it's completely useless talking to you, and goes off, which was what Whitehead wanted at 3 o'clock in the morning. He didn't want to have this conversation, but whatever the sort of components of a proposition or the expression of a proposition are, there's more required for the proposition to be sayable or for the expression to be something you can use to say something than that there just be a set of elements, the components of the sentence. It's got to be more than just a set of expressions or even a list, a concatenated list of expressions. They have to fit together right. And the problem that gets labeled the unity of the proposition is to characterize how those bits have to go together. Now, maybe you do that from the world side, from what's said, and you're thinking about the components of the proposition, or maybe you do it from the linguistic side, sort of from the problem. You don't want to prejudge that. But that issue of what the expressions or whatever the components of something you can say, that snow is white, are, how do they hang together? Downstream from that a little bit, are those elements structurally homogeneous? Are they all the same kind of thing? For instance, are they all names of things? This is going to be one of the issues between Sellars and Bergman in the essay. Sellars saying actually they're all the same kind of thing. They're all names. And Bergman saying, no, you got to have a name and something that's not a name of a particular but of a universal. So the name of a particular and the name of a universal in order to have things. The second issue, related but not identical to this, is the world, the universe, everything there is it a collection of things or a collection of facts? Things, objects, I hear thing as generic, but people don't always hear thing and object as generic in this case. If you're being careful, you probably want to say particulars, because somebody could think, well, it's all events, or it's all processes, and think those aren't really thingy, they're not substance-like, but they're particulars, they're things you can refer to with names. I mean, when I say thing, object, even particular, or generic, my actual view is that those terms are not proper sortal expressions. They're not proper common nouns because they don't come with criteria of identity and individuation. You know, if we ask how many things are on the surface of the table here, we couldn't count them because you don't know whether the shadow of the glass is a thing or the upper quadrant of the shadow is a thing. To have a proper sortal, a proper common noun, there have to be criteria of identity and individuation. Is this the same K as that? And thing, unit, object, particular, they don't let you count those things yet. Those terms are prosortals in that they stand in grammatically for a real sortal. Or they're pseudo-sortals, grammatically masquerading as sortals, again, placeholders occupying the grammatical positions of common nouns, but not able actually to do the work of them. David Lewis knows what he means by a thing. He says ultimate physics is going to tell us what the ultimate subatomic particles are, and those are things, and all and only mereological sums of those things are things. That's what I mean by thing. And now those you can count. If you can count the particles, the mereological way of forming new terms from them, you can count those. I mean, this is not a plausible view, but it's a clear view. Um, Wittgenstein starts off the Tractatus saying, that's not the world that you're talking about as this collection of things. The world is everything that is the case. Die Welt ist, was der Fall ist. Collection of facts, not of things. And that's desperately important to him. Sellars, adopting the Tractarian view of facts and objects, he's going to disagree with that absolutely fundamental Tractarian, fundamental, it's proposition one, with that Tractarian view, because he's a realist. It's a world of particulars. What exists in the world in the narrow sense is just particulars, not facts, which, remember, fact is a sortal that has thinkables under it, things expressed by declarative sentences, which we could nominalize in the form of propositions, or if they're true, facts. And he's going to say those are onomatoids, not genuine names. I mean, I'll mention that I think Wittgenstein, I think this is an incredible insight of his to think of the world as a world of facts. He screws it up by his own lights almost immediately. In 1.11, he says the world is determined by the facts, and by these being all the facts. And by his own lights, the last half of that, though it's crucial for him, isn't something that can be said, and it isn't something that can be shown either, in his sense of show. And yet he requires it to do serious work for him. But I'm not going to argue that. I just can't pass by Proposition 1 without mentioning that. I think this question of whether you think of the world as everything that is the case or as a collection of particulars is the most fundamental metaphysical question you can ask. I spend a fair amount of my time trying to hold John McDowell's feet to the fire to get him to commit on questions that he has never addressed in print. And this might be the one that I have spent the most time pushing him on. You could say either one. It's not a question that interests him as interested as he is in Wittgenstein, but his official view is you could say either one, which I gather means, well, there's a sense in which it's all the facts, and there's a sense in which it's all the things, and you can talk either way, at which point I want to know, and what's the relation between those? Between talking the one way and talking the other way. A further deponent saith not. He will not address this question. But I think it's important to address it, in particular because people are perennially tempted to think of objects as parts of facts, as components in a very literal sense of facts. in ordinary language, we talk about the objects as being what the facts are about. You know, let me tell you, many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. The facts are about the objects. Well, that aboutness sounds like a semantic relation, but we're just talking about the world, aren't we? The world of facts and the world of objects. So Sellars says in this essay, I'm jumping ahead. Yeah.
So do you think, were you rejecting the claim that facts are about objects?
No.
Oh, no, okay.
No.
Because you said you used the language of tempted, and so I thought that I took that to indicate that was a... Okay.
The temptation I was describing was to think of the objects as parts of the facts.
I see.
Okay. And I was suggesting this other consideration as intention.
I see.
That.
Okay.
I'm really pretty sure the objects are not parts of the facts.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, when you're saying that the second part of 1.11 in Tractatus, it's doing more work. It says something like it's doing more work than maybe Wittgenstein intended. What exactly do you?
Oh no! What I meant to say is that it does work that he can't do without. He needs a notion of all the facts that, by his own lights, he can't be entitled to. My own view is that the notion of all the facts is unintelligible. That facts are specified in a vocabulary that requires you to quantify over all possible vocabularies, and that's something that, in the end, it's not obviously unintelligible, but in the end it is unintelligible. And this is really important for people who think things like that in the dimension of describing and explaining science is the measure of all things, of those that they are, and of those that are not, that they are not. They're thinking that typically that you can state all the facts in the language of fundamental physics. Sellars isn't actually committed to that. He just thinks you can specify all the particulars in the language of physics. He doesn't say, in the dimension of describing and explaining, science is the measure of what is and what it is. Just that it is. And that's important. Okay, I'm still at a very hand-wavy phase, but introducing this constellation of commitments. If we think about how it stands between a statement of a fact, something linguistic, and the fact that it states, is the relation between those something that you can state? This is a question notoriously in the Tractatus, about which Sellars says in one of our passages, the crucial ineffability in the Tractatus concerns the relations between statements and facts. Is there such a relation, and is it ineffable? The answer seems to me to be the following. There is a meaning relation between statements and facts, but both terms are in the linguistic order. In the linguistic order, that is, not in the world in the narrow sense. There aren't facts in the world in the narrow sense. There's only particulars. And facts are onomatoids. Statements of facts are onomatoids. And then there's the question, and this I think is a really subtle question. It matters deeply to Wittgenstein and to Sellars. Should we think of the statement of a fact as a complex object, an arrangement of names, for instance, or should we think of it as a fact? And here, Sellars focuses on one of the most astonishing and, I think, deepest parts of the Tractatus, the pi passages around 3.14. In particular, 3.1432, we must not say the complex sign ARB says A stands in relation R to B. We must say that A stands in a certain relation to B says that A are B. And what he said in 3.14, the propositional sign consists in the fact that its elements, the words, are combined in a definite way. The propositional sign is a fact. And so he says the proposition is not just a mixture of words, the proposition is articulate, and in 3.142, only facts can express a sense. But in 3.143, that the propositional sign is a fact is concealed by the ordinary form of expression, written or printed. And Sellars' invention of jumblies is going to be his way of saying what's right about that. But this constellation of questions about facts, propositions, and objects or names, all these things are related, but they're not. The issues are not identical to each other. Taking a stand on the one leaves many of the other things open to you. And Sellars, I think, has a wonderful way into this. So now I'm stepping away from I've just been gesturing at these big, deep, but messy issues. And says, the scalpel that we're going to use to think through these things is Bradley's regress in appearance and reality. Bradley took this regress to show the unintelligibility of understanding things as standing in relation to one another. He'll say finite things or independent things. That is the unintelligibility in principle of any bottom-up explanation or description of things. We've got to start with the absolute and make distinctions within it. One way of putting his view, this was greatly exercised Russell in the 1880s and 1890s, was in terms of a distinction between internal and external relations, where Russell's example is a ladder. The relation between the rungs and the rails of the ladder is an internal relation, internal to the ladder. Whereas the relation of the ladder to the wall that it's leaning up against is an external one. And you can tell that because you'd still have the ladder. You wouldn't have to destroy it to change its external relations. You could take it from one side of the house and lean it up against another side of the house. There would still be the same ladder. But if you change the internal relations, the relations between the rungs and the rails, you don't have the ladder anymore. And Bradley's view was that all relations are internal relations. There actually are no external relations. Everything is internally related to everything else. It's all the absolute. And Russell's recoil from that was essentially to say all relations are external relations. That was atomism as opposed to holism. Russell also memorably described this as the difference between thinking of the world as a bowl of jelly and thinking of it as a bucket of shot. And Quine, in Two Dogmas, says, well, this notion of essence, which is articulated by the internal relations of something, as opposed to the accidents, the external relations that it stands in. The notion of meaning is what essence becomes if you detach it from the thing and attach it to the words. As he said, this issue about atomism or holism has a semantic analog. Whether you think of a meaning as having these internal relations, can't change them without changing the meaning. So if you say green isn't a color, you've changed the meaning of green. But if you say that tractor is green, well, you could deny that without changing the meaning of green. That's an external relation of the meaning. What Quine saw is you can think about these issues in ontological terms, or you can think about them in semantic terms, but the same sort of issues come up. And Quine was running the Bradleyan line that you have to go holistic and think of all the relations as on a par. Okay, that's just mentioning an old metaphysical issue. Bradley's regress was one of the tools that he deployed in arguing for this way of thinking about things. So he says, let's think about two things that are related. ARB, Romeo loves Juliet. We can write that down schematically. ARB, non-schematically, Romeo loves Juliet. But now if we want to understand that, we have to understand not just how, so we want to understand that this is a unity of proposition issue. If we want to understand the unity of that fact or that proposition, we have to understand how that relation loves holds Romeo and Juliet together. How does it relate them? We've got Romeo and Juliet and this relation of loving between them. But what's the relation between Romeo and loving and Juliet? Let's say she's beloved rather than the lover in this case. What's the relation between the relation and the two things that it relates? Well, we could say Romeo and Juliet exemplify the relation loves. Exemplification is the relation between the relation and the relata. But now if we really want to understand that, we have to understand the relation between exemplification and a relation that can be exemplified by objects. what's the relation between exemplification and loving? Such that Romeo can be related to Juliet if they exemplify the relation of loving. Well, we could give that, the relation between exemplification and relations, another name. But we'd still need to know what relation it stands in to exemplification and relations, in virtue of which, by standing in that relation to exemplification and the relation of loving, Romeo and Juliet end up related to one another. See, it was really Bradley raising this that raised the question about how to understand the unity of the proposition. Frege had already raised it and had a much different, well, I guess contemporaneously raised it and had a much different line on it. So there's a regress. How to understand relations. It seems like you have to understand the relation between the relation and the relata to do that, and you can just keep turning that crank. But it's a vicious regress because you don't understand how the relation ties Romeo and Juliet together unless you understand exemplification, how they could exemplify a relation. And you don't understand that unless you understand the relation between exemplification and the relations that can be exemplified by objects, and so on. And Bradley's view was there was no way to resolve this except to conclude that the notion we started with of objects standing in relations is unintelligible. Now, it doesn't matter for this argument that you start with relations. You could start with the yield sign is triangular, and we still want to know, well, what's the relation between triangularity and the object? Well, the object exemplifies triangularity. Well, what's the relation? But everything above level 1 is about relations. So you might as well start with relations at the bottom so you can see that the same thing going on. Now, in naming and saying, Sellars talks about perspicuous languages, and the Tractatus is meant to be a perspicuous language, and Jumbelese, he says, is the really perspicuous language. And Bergman has a different view about what a perspicuous language would be. In the passages that I've excerpted from naming and saying here, the word perspicuous appears 24 times in these 6 pages. Sellars doesn't say what he means by it until in passing, late in the essay, and this is passage 23 on page 5 in the handout. He defines what he means. He talks about a perspicuous language, i.e., a language which had a built-in protection against Bradley's puzzle. A perspicuous language is going to be one for which you can't make the Bradleyan argument. The sense in which it's perspicuous is you can't confuse yourself in the way Bradley got confused in this language. Now, as I say, this is more than 2/3 of the way through his essay, that he gives what I claim is the definition of perspicuous that he's using throughout, and he doesn't even then flag it as the definition. He puts it in an appositive, i.e. this. Kids, don't write like this. It would have been much easier to understand the essay if he had said that this is all driven by Bradley's puzzle, and what he's looking for is a language that's perspicuous in the sense that it'll tell us where we got off on the wrong foot to subject ourselves to the Bradleyan argument. And that he's going to take doing that as the Ariadne's thread that will guide him through thinking about facts and objects, what's in the world, what the unity of a proposition is, what it is that statements and the facts they state have in common, all this tangle of issues. This is going to be the way he's defining the path that he's going to follow through that. And the strategy for being perspicuous, he does give us early in the essay. It's from passage 8 at the bottom of page 1 of the handout. We're going to focus on features of discourse about what is or is not the case, so ordinary empirical fact-stating discourse. Features of discourse which show themselves, i.e., are present in a perspicuous language not as words, but in the manner in which words are combined. And so he's got a notion of perspicuous that's going to be a language that avoids Bradley's regress. And it's going to do it by having some features of discourse not marked by the occurrence of words, but marked by the way the words that are there are arranged. In particular, not by particulars in the expression, but by facts about them. That's his understanding of what Tractarian showing is. And he's going to claim some features of discourse have to have that feature. They have to be marked not by the occurrence of particular words, but by facts about the particular words that are there. And there's perspicuous ways of doing that and unperspicuous ways of doing that. And you get into Bradley's trouble if you do it in unperspicuous ways. So I'm saying start with Bradley's regress, define perspicuity as avoiding that, and then here's an idea that a language is unperspicuous if it's picking the wrong features of the language to mark by the occurrence of an expression, a thing, an object, a particular in the expression, as opposed to the features of the discourse that are marked by facts about those expressions. That is, he says, by modes of arrangement of them. So that's four steps so far. And the fifth step is, he says, there's basically only two ways to go. the Tractarian way, he's going to go with Jumbelese, and the way Bergman goes. In fact, it's clear that there's an ultra-Bergmanian alternative, indeed a set of higher-order Bergmanian ways, but nothing new happens if you go farther up. All the differences are differences between Jumbelese and Bergmanese perspicuous languages. And so what he does in this essay, that's the fifth move. Sixth move is compare and contrast these two ways of constructing perspicuous, these two ways of thinking about of constructing what you hope will be perspicuous languages, these two strategies for perspicuity. Okay, is that clear enough as a strategy? I say, he could have written the essay better, though as a matter of fact, this is one of his clearer essays. I mean, for instance, compared to the two that we read last week, this one is straightforward. I mean, I think in general, seriously reading a paper is always rewriting it, and that's sort of, I'm presenting you the way, thinking that I've understood what he's doing. Well, not all of it, but what I've understood of it. There's a better way to tell the story than he told it, and it would be in these stages.